"You don't deserve to be here," Margaret Hensley said, her smile cutting through the applause in the Edison High auditorium like a knife. The words, laced with condescension and weight, implied that Amara Brooks, a young black teacher named Educator of the Year, owed her success to circumstance, not talent. Amara stood on stage, her calm gaze fixed on her students, unwavering. The room tensed. Who was the silent person in the back row watching it all? What was behind Margaret's veiled insult? Would Amara respond, or would the silence speak louder? Join us as we explore a story that changes perspectives. Where are you watching? Drop it in the comments and subscribe to follow our latest stories. Don't miss the moment that changes everything. The auditorium of Edison High School thrummed with a restless pulse, as if the very walls held their breath under the weight of anticipation. Chandeliers hung like silent sentinels, their golden light spilling across rows of chairs filled with parents, students, and faculty. Each face a blend of pride, curiosity, and something sharper: expectation. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood and fresh lilies, arranged in elegant clusters along the stage's edge. Tonight was no mere gathering. It was the Educator of the Year ceremony, and Amara Brooks, a young black teacher whose name carried the quiet force of a rising tide, was its heart. Amara stepped onto the stage, and the room seemed to pause, caught in the gravity of her presence. Her white dress flowed like moonlight, soft yet commanding, paired with a crisp blazer adorned with a single embroidered flower, a delicate nod to her strength. A silver clutch gleamed in her hand, catching the stage lights like a beacon. Her hair, swept into a sleek bun, framed eyes that burned with quiet resolve, scanning not for approval but for something deeper, something only she could see. The applause rose, warm but uneven, as if the crowd sensed the night held more than they'd been promised. Her gaze drifted to the back of the auditorium, where shadows clung to the edges of the light. No one followed her eyes. Not yet. There in the final row sat Dr. Elijah Brooks, a man whose presence was as understated as it was profound. His black suit was impeccable, the gold pin of the school district glinting faintly on his lapel, a subtle mark of his role as regional superintendent over 11 public schools. But tonight, he was no administrator, no figure of authority who had turned down government posts to reshape a struggling education system. He was a father, his hands folded calmly, his eyes locked on his daughter with a stillness that seemed to anchor the chaos of the room. No one noticed him, no whispers marked his presence. He was simply there, a silent force waiting to be felt. The host, a man with a too bright smile and a voice polished to a fault, took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone skating the line between enthusiasm and routine, "we gather to honor Amara Brooks, a teacher who has redefined dedication." The crowd clapped, a few students letting out cheers that cut through the polite hum. Amara's lips curved into a smile, warm but with an edge of restraint, as if she knew the night was a tightrope and she was already balancing. Behind her, a screen flickered to life, displaying images of her in the classroom, laughing with students, scribbling equations, handing out books with a care that felt almost reverent. Each frame told a story of a woman who didn't just teach but ignited, who saw potential where others saw obstacles. Yet beneath the host's polished words, there was a tremor in the air, a sense that the script was only a veneer. The crowd felt it, a prickle of unease, a moment waiting to tip. Amara stood at the podium, her silver clutch resting lightly beside her, its shimmer a quiet defiance against the room's scrutiny. She didn't speak, not yet. Her silence was a force, drawing every eye, every breath into its orbit. The host rattled on, listing her achievements, her innovative lessons, her mentorship of struggling students, her ability to bridge divides in a community frayed by unspoken tensions. But his words felt hollow, like a melody played just out of vow. Amara's eyes, still fixed on that shadowed corner, flickered briefly as the host gestured toward her. She stepped closer to the podium, the faint rustle of her dress amplified by the microphone. a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden hush. The spotlight framed her, casting a soft glow around her silhouette. But it was her presence that held the room. Not the light, not the stage, not the applause. She was a flame, steady and unyielding, and the auditorium was kindling, waiting to catch. The auditorium of Edison High School held its breath as the applause for Amara Brooks faded, leaving a fragile silence in its wake. The chandeliers above cast their golden glow, but the warmth felt brittle, as if the room itself sensed a shift coming. Amara stood at the podium, her white dress catching the light like a quiet promise, her silver clutch resting beside her like a sentinel. Her eyes, sharp and steady, lingered on the shadowed back row where Dr. Elijah Brooks sat, unnoticed, his presence a silent anchor. The host, still basking in the afterglow of his introduction, stepped aside, his smile a touch too eager as he gestured toward the next speaker. The air tightened, as if the room knew something was about to slip from the script. Margaret Hensley ascended the stage with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. A prominent parent, her name was synonymous with influence. Fundraisers, school board meetings, whispered sway over district decisions. Her tailored navy dress hugged her frame, its crisp lines a stark contrast to Amara's softer elegance. Her blonde hair was swept into an impeccable chignon, and her smile, polished to perfection, gleamed under the stage lights. Yet there was something in her eyes, a glint of calculation, a flicker of intent that didn't quite match the warmth she projected. The crowd leaned forward, not out of admiration but instinct, sensing the weight of her presence. She was no stranger to this stage, and she knew it. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret began, her voice smooth as velvet but edged with something sharper. "It's truly an honor to be here tonight, celebrating such a remarkable educator." Her words were honeyed, each syllable measured, but they carried a subtle undertone like a blade wrapped in silk. She turned toward Amara, her smile widening just enough to feel performative. "Amara Brooks has done something extraordinary, hasn't she? To see her up here shining so brightly, it's remarkable really how someone with her unique background can connect so deeply with certain students." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the auditorium. On the surface, they were a compliment, a nod to Amara's ability to inspire. But beneath, they carried a sting, a veiled suggestion that her success was not born of intellect or effort, but of circumstance, of being the right kind of story for a school hungry for diversity. A few parents in the front rows chuckled, softly, their laughter thin and uncertain, as if they weren't sure whether to agree or recoil. Others exchanged glances, their brows furrowing, sensing the barb but not yet naming it. The students scattered among the adults sat straighter, their eyes darting between Margaret and Amara, waiting for something to break. Amara didn't flinch. Her hands rested lightly on the podium, her posture unchanged, but her fingers brushed the edge of her silver clutch, a movement so subtle it might have gone unnoticed. Her face remained calm, her lips still curved in that faint, guarded smile, but her eyes, those eyes that had sought the back row, sharpened. They didn't meet Margaret's gaze. Instead, they drifted to the students in the crowd, the ones she'd spent late nights tutoring, the ones who'd confided in her when the world felt too heavy. She looked at them as if to say, "I see you, and this is not for me. It's for you." In rain. The back row, Dr. Elijah Brooks remained still, his black suit blending into the shadows. His hands, folded calmly on his knees, betrayed no tension, but his eyes never left the stage. The gold pin on his lapel caught a stray beam of light, a fleeting glint that seemed to pulse with quiet strength. He was invisible to the crowd, unmentioned, the program. Yet his presence was a weight, a force that seemed to press against the edges of Margaret's words. He didn't shift, didn't nod, didn't react, but his stillness was louder than the scattered chuckles that followed Margaret's remark. Margaret continued, undeterred, her voice rising with a practiced lilt. "It's inspiring, really. how Amara's story resonates with those who need it most. Growing up in a challenging environment, she's found a way to turn that into something meaningful. The words were carefully chosen, each one a brushstroke painting Amara as a product of hardship rather than brilliance. The implication hung heavy. Her place on this stage was a gift of circumstance, not a triumph of will. A few more parents nodded, their agreement hesitant, as if they wanted to believe the praise but couldn't shake the unease creeping into their chests. The host, standing off to the side, shifted his weight, his smile faltering for a split second. He glanced at Amara, then at Margaret, as if unsure whether to steer the moment back to safety. The screen behind the stage still displayed images of Amara in her classroom, her hand on a student's shoulder, her laughter bright as she explained a concept. But now those images felt distant, overshadowed by the tension weaving through the room. The lilies along the stage's edge seemed to droop slightly, as if wilting under the weight of unspoken truths. Amara's silence was a force of its own. She didn't interrupt, didn't counter, didn't even shift her stance. But her gaze, now fixed on the students, was a quiet rebellion, a refusal to let Margaret's words define her. The auditorium, so full of sound moments ago, grew taut, the air thick with the sense that something sacred had been brushed against, something that demanded to be named but wasn't yet ready to speak. A student in the third row, a girl with braids and a notebook clutched tightly, stared at Amara, her eyes wide with something like pride, like defiance. Margaret, sensing the shift but mistaking it for her own triumph, pressed on. "We're so lucky to have someone like Amara, someone who can bridge those gaps for our children." Her smile was unwavering, but her eyes flicked to the crowd, seeking validation. She didn't see the man in the back row, didn't feel the weight of his gaze. She didn't know that every word she spoke was being measured, not by the applause she craved, but by a father who had taught his daughter to stand tall without needing to shout. The moment hung there, fragile and electric, a thread stretched tight between praise and provocation. The crowd was no longer just an audience. They were witnesses, caught in the space between Margaret's calculated words and Amara's un. The auditorium of Edison High School was a cauldron of unspoken tension, the air thick with the aftertaste of Margaret Hensley's barbed praise. The chandeliers above cast their golden light, but it felt colder now, as if the room itself recoiled from the words still echoing. Amara Brooks stood at the podium, her white dress a beacon of quiet defiance, her silver clutch glinting like a shield against the stage's edge. Her silence, unbroken after Margaret's veiled insult, was not surrender, but a gathering storm, its force felt by every student who met her steady gaze. Margaret, still basking in her moment, stepped back with a smile that lingered too long, unaware of the shift rippling through the crowd. The host, visibly uneasy, fumbled with his notes, his polished charm fraying under the weight of a moment no script could contain. Then the camera, operated by a young technician who sensed something unspoken, panned slowly across the auditorium. It lingered for a fleeting moment, 3 seconds perhaps, on a figure in the last row shrouded in shadow. Dr. Elijah Brooks sat there, his black suit blending into the dimness, the gold pin on his lapel catching a stray beam of light. His hands rested calmly on his knees, his posture neither rigid nor relaxed, but imbued with a quiet gravity that seemed to pull the room toward him. No one in the audience knew his name, not yet. No program listed him, no introduction heralded his presence. But his eyes, fixed on the stage, held an intensity that cut through the haze of Margaret's words like a blade through fog. Dr. Elijah Brooks was no stranger to rooms like this. As the regional superintendent of 11 public schools, he had stood before national conferences, his voice shaping policies that lifted struggling districts from the brink. He had turned down offers from Washington to stay rooted in this city, where he believed change began not in boardrooms, but in classrooms, like his daughters. Yet tonight he was not the man who had reformed a system or silenced critics with his measured eloquence. He was a father, invisible to the crowd, His presence a quiet pulse that thrummed beneath the surface. His pin, etched with the district's emblem, was a subtle mark of his authority, but it was his stillness that spoke loudest, a stillness that seemed to say, "I am here, and I am watching." The camera's brief pause on him went unnoticed by most. A few teachers in the middle rows, recognizing the glint of his pin, exchanged whispers, their eyes widening as they placed him. "Is that Dr. Brooks?" one murmured, her voice barely audible over the rustle of programs. Another nodded, her gaze darting to Amara, as if seeing her anew. They knew him as the man who had walked away from power to rebuild schools, who had faced skeptical boards and hostile parents with a calm that disarmed. But here, he was not here to speak, not here to claim the spotlight. He was here for Amara, to witness her stand in a world that had already tried to diminish her. On stage, Amara's hands rested lightly on the podium, her fingers grazing the edge of her silver clutch. Her eyes, which had lingered on the students, flickered briefly toward that shadowed corner where her father sat. It was a glance so subtle it might have been a trick of the light, but it carried a weight that anchored her. Margaret's words, her unique background as certain students, still hung in the air, their sting lingering like smoke. The crowd, caught between discomfort and curiosity, shifted in their seats, their applause for Margaret's speech long faded. A student in the front row, a boy with a worn backpack and eyes too old for his age, stared at Amara, his hands clenched as if willing her to speak. The host, sensing the need to reclaim control, stepped forward, his voice a touch too loud. "Thank you, Mrs. Hensley, for those insightful words," he said, his smile strained. He turned to Amara, his eyes pleading for her to smooth the moment over. "Ms. Brooks, perhaps you'd like to share a few words before we move on." The invitation was a lifeline, a chance to shift the narrative, to reclaim the stage. But Amara didn't take it, not yet. Her silence stretched, not heavy but deliberate, like a painter choosing the perfect moment to touch brush to canvas. The auditorium, already taut, grew quieter still, every rustle of fabric, every cough amplified in the absence of her voice. In the back row, Dr. Elijah Brooks remained motionless, his eyes never wavering from his daughter. He didn't need to speak, didn't need to rise. His presence was enough, a quiet testament to the woman Amara had become, shaped by his lessons, his sacrifices, his unwavering belief in her. The teacher's whispers spread, a soft ripple through the crowd, but they didn't reach the front rows where parents like Margaret sat, oblivious to the man who could have commanded the room but chose not to. His silence was not passive. It was a force, a mirror reflecting the truth of every word spoken on that stage. The camera panned back to Amara, catching the faint curve of her lips, a smile that held neither anger nor fear, but something fiercer, resolve. The lilies along the stage's edge seemed to lean toward her, their petals trembling in the faint draft of the auditorium. The students, scattered among the adults, sat forward, their eyes locked on her, sensing that this moment was theirs as much as it was hers. The host shifted again, his fingers twitching around his notes as if he could feel the room slipping from his grasp. Margaret, standing off to the side, adjusted her stance, her smile still fixed but her eyes darting to the crowd, seeking the approval she was accustomed to. She didn't see Dr. Elijah Brooks, didn't feel the weight of his gaze. She didn't know that the man in the back row was rewriting the story she thought she controlled, not with words, but with his presence. The auditorium was no longer just a stage. It was a crucible, and Amara stood at its center, her silence, a spark waiting to ignite. The man in the back row watched, and though no one else could name it, his gaze was the wind that would soon turn the tide. The auditorium of Edison High School was a taut wire, vibrating with the unspoken weight of Margaret Hensley's veiled barbs and Amara Brooks' resolute silence. The chandelier's golden light flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to dance with the tension in the room. Amara stood at the podium, her white dress glowing like a quiet defiance, her silver clutch a gleaming anchor beside her. The crowd, a mosaic of parents, students, and faculty, sat on the edge of their seats, their breaths shallow, as if waiting for the air itself to crack. Margaret, now seated at the stage's edge, wore a smile that had begun to fray, her eyes darting for validation she could no longer find. In the back row, Dr. Elijah Brooks remained a shadow, his gold pin glinting faintly, his gaze a steady pulse that held his daughter upright. The host, his voice faltering, cleared his throat and gestured toward Amara. "Ms. Brooks," he said, his tone pleading for resolution, "would you share a few words with us?" Amara's eyes, which had lingered on the students and briefly on her father, now settled on the podium. She didn't rush to speak. The silence stretched, not heavy but deliberate, like the pause before a storm breaks. Her fingers brushed the edge of her clutch, a movement so subtle it seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. The lilies along the stage quivered in the faint draft, their petals a fragile contrast to the steel in her posture. Then she leaned forward, her voice clear and measured, cutting through the auditorium like a blade of light. "I was once asked," she began, her words slow, deliberate, "how a child learns resilience." The room stilled, the rustle of programs ceased, the whispers of teachers faded, and even the host's nervous fidgeting paused. Amara's voice was not loud, but it filled the space, each syllable a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples through every heart. She didn't look at Margaret, didn't acknowledge the sting of her earlier words. Instead, her gaze swept the students, lingering on a girl in the third row clutching a notebook, a boy with a worn backpack, a young man whose eyes shone with quiet trust. "I didn't learn resilience from struggle," she said, her tone steady but warm, like a hearth fire. "I learned it from my father." In the back row, Dr. Elijah Brooks remained motionless, his hands folded, his eyes fixed on his daughter. The gold pin on his lapel caught the light, a silent emblem of his legacy. Amara's voice grew softer, not weaker, but intimate, as if she were speaking to each person individually. "My father, Dr. Elijah Brooks, could have sat in rooms far grander than this one. He was offered seats of power, positions in Washington, titles that would have carried his name across the country. But he chose to stay here, in this city, to sit at our dinner table, to read every essay I wrote, to pour his ideals into me, not with words, but with time." The crowd was no longer an audience, but a congregation, hanging on her every word. A parent in the front row shifted, her eyes glistening, as if Amara's story had stirred something long buried. A student whispered to another, their heads bowed. Not in distraction, but reverence. Amara's voice rose slightly, not in volume, but in conviction. "I didn't grow up in want," she said, her eyes briefly meeting her father's across the distance. "I grew up in expectation, not to succeed, but to live kindly, to build something that lasts beyond me." The auditorium was a crucible now, each word forging something new in the hearts of those who listened. The screen behind Amara, still displaying images of her classroom, seemed to fade, the real story unfolding in her voice. The lilies trembled, as if bowing to the truth she spoke. Margaret Hensley, seated to the side, clasped her hands tightly, her smile gone, her face a mask of unease. She hadn't expected this, not Amara's calm, not her refusal to engage with the earlier slight, not the way her words turned the room's attention inward, forcing each person to confront their own assumptions. Amara paused, letting her words settle. The silence that followed was not empty, but alive, filled with the weight of her father's presence, unseen yet felt. Dr. Elijah Brooks didn't move, didn't nod, but his eyes shone with a pride that needed no voice. The teachers who had whispered his name earlier now sat in awe, their programs forgotten. The students, especially the ones Amara had mentored, leaned forward, their faces alight with something fiercer than pride, loyalty. The boy with the backpack clenched his fists, as if ready to stand for her, while the girl with the notebook scribbled furiously, capturing words she'd carry for years. The host, sensing the moment's gravity, hesitated to interrupt. His notes lay abandoned, his script useless against the tide of Amara's story. The camera, still roving, caught Dr. Elijah Brooks for another fleeting second. His face a portrait of quiet strength, every wrinkle a testament to battles fought. And one without fanfare. The crowd didn't see him, not fully, but his presence was a current, pulling the room toward a truth Margaret's words had tried to bury. Amara's voice softened again, almost a whisper, yet it carried to every corner. Resilience isn't about surviving, she said. It's about choosing to build, even when others expect you to break. Her eyes, now steady on the crowd, held no anger, only clarity. The auditorium was no longer just a stage. It was a mirror reflecting the weight of every choice, every word, every silence. Amara stepped back from the podium, her clutch untouched, her dress catching the light like a beacon. The room didn't erupt in applause, not yet. It was too still, too caught in the spell of her words, in the invisible metal she wore, forged not in acclaim, but in the quiet expectations of a father who sat in the shadows, watching his daughter shine. The auditorium of Edison High School hung in a fragile stillness, Amara Brooks's words about resilience and her father's quiet sacrifices lingering like embers in the air. The chandelier's golden glow seemed dimmer now, as if the room itself bowed to the weight of her speech. Amara stood at the podium, her white dress radiant, her silver clutch a silent sentinel by her side. Her eyes, steady and warm, rested on the students, who gazed back with a mix of awe and loyalty. Margaret Hensley, seated at the stage's edge, clutched her hands tightly, her earlier confidence eroded, her smile a brittle mask. In the back row, Dr. Elijah Brooks sat unmoving, his black suit blending into the shadows, his gold pin a faint glint of authority. The host, his script forgotten, stood frozen, sensing the moment had slipped beyond his control. The lilies along the stage trembled, as if they too felt the pulse of something seismic about to break. Then, a small sound pierced the silence, a chair creaking in the middle rows. Heads turned, eyes searching, as a voice, young but clear, rose from the crowd. If it weren't for Ms. Brooks, I'd have dropped out last semester. The words, unpolished but raw, cut through the auditorium like a spark igniting dry tinder. A boy no older than 17 stood, his school uniform crisp but slightly worn, his blonde hair falling into eyes that burned with conviction. He was a white student, unremarkable in the sea of faces, yet his voice carried a weight that made the room lean forward. The camera, operated by an instinctive technician, swung toward him, capturing the tremor in his hands, the fire in his gaze. He stepped into the aisle, his sneakers scuffing softly against the polished floor, and moved toward the stage. The crowd parted, not out of ceremony but instinct, as if making way for a truth that demanded space. Amara's eyes found his, and for a moment, they held a silent conversation, teacher and student, protector and protected. The boy reached the stage, stopping just short of the steps, his voice steady despite the quiver in his frame. Ms. Brooks was the only one who came to my house when I was drowning in my own head, he said, his words slicing through the hush. I was depressed, lost, ready to give up. She didn't bring grades or lectures. She brought cookies, homemade warm, and a note that said, "You're still worth something." The auditorium was a held breath, every eye locked on the boy. His words weren't rehearsed, weren't polished, but they carried the raw honesty of someone who had been seen when he thought he was invisible. He turned to the crowd, his gaze sweeping past Margaret, past the host, landing on the students who sat wide-eyed, some nodding, others gripping their seats. If Ms. Brooks is only here because of her background, like some people say, he continued, his voice rising with a defiance that belied his age, then I wish I could be as special as her, because she's the only one who made me believe I could keep going. The room erupted, not in chaos but in a thunderous wave of applause that shook the rafters. Students stood first, their cheers sharp and fierce, followed by teachers, then parents, their clapping a mix of admiration and shame. The lilies seemed to sway with the sound, their petals catching the light like fragments of a broken spell. Amara stood still, her hands resting on the podium, her face soft but unyielding. as if she'd known this moment was coming but hadn't planned for its power. Her eyes flickered to the back row, where Dr. Elijah Brooks sat, his expression unchanged, but his eyes gleaming with a pride that needed no words. Margaret Hensley's face was a study in fracture. Her hands, once clasped tightly, now trembled. Her earlier words, unique background and certain students, echoing like a misstep she couldn't retract. She didn't look at the boy, didn't meet Amara's gaze. Her eyes darted to the floor, as if searching for the confidence she'd lost. The host, caught off guard, fumbled for words, his microphone dangling uselessly. "Well, that was powerful," he managed, his voice thin against the roar of the crowd. The camera panned wildly, catching the boy's resolute stance, Amara's quiet strength, and for a fleeting moment Dr. Elijah Brooks, whose silence was louder than the applause. The boy stepped back, his moment done, but his words lingered, a spark that had set the room ablaze. Students whispered to each other, their faces alight with something new, pride, defiance, a shared understanding that Amara was more than a teacher. She was a lifeline. A girl in the third row, clutching a notebook, wiped her eyes, her pen still poised as if to capture the moment forever. A parent in the back, who had chuckled at Margaret's earlier remarks, now sat stone-faced, his hands folded as if wrestling with his own complicity. Dr. Elijah Brooks remained in the shadows, his gold pin a quiet beacon. He didn't stand, didn't speak, but his presence was a tide, pulling the room toward a truth Margaret's words had tried to bury. The teachers who had recognized him earlier now sat in reverence, their whispers replaced by nods of respect. The camera lingered on Amara, her white dress glowing, her silver clutch a symbol of her unshakable resolve. The applause began to fade, but the energy didn't. It settled into a charged silence, a collective realization that this was no longer just a ceremony, but a reckoning. The auditorium was a crucible, forged by a boy's courage and Amara's quiet strength. The lilies stood sentinel, their fragrance mingling with the weight of truth. Margaret's words, once sharp, now felt hollow, exposed by a student who had turned her insinuations into dust. The host, still adrift, glanced at Amara, hoping for a cue, but she offered none. Her silence, her presence, was enough. In the back row, Dr. Elijah Brooks watched, his eyes a mirror of his daughter's resolve, a silent vow that this moment, this truth would not be forgotten. The auditorium of Edison High School was a charged vessel, the echoes of a student's raw testimony still reverberating through the air. The chandeliers cast their golden light, but it felt softer now, as if humbled by the weight of the moment. Amara Brooks stood at the podium, her white dress a radiant emblem of resilience, her silver clutch glinting like a quiet vow. The crowd, a tapestry of students, parents, and faculty, sat frozen, their applause for the boy's words fading into a hush that felt alive, electric. Margaret Hensley, her navy dress stark against the stage's edge, gripped her hands so tightly her knuckles whitened, her face a fractured mask of composure. The host, his script a forgotten relic, stood mute, his eyes darting between Amara and the crowd, searching for a way to reclaim the moment. But this was no longer his stage. It belonged to something greater, something unspoken, yet undeniable. In the back row, Dr. Elijah Brooks rose to his feet. The movement was slow, deliberate, without a creak of the chair or a rustle of fabric. His black suit blended into the shadows, but the gold pin on his lapel caught the light, a fleeting spark that seemed to pulse with purpose. The crowd turned, heads swiveling as if pulled by an invisible thread. They had expected him to stride to the stage, to claim the microphone and deliver a speech that would cement the moment. But he didn't move forward. He stood, hands at his sides, his eyes locked on Amara with a pride so profound it needed no words. His silence was not absence, it was presence, a force that pressed against the room like a tide, reshaping its currents. The camera, guided by an unseen instinct, lingered on him for a moment too long, capturing the lines etched into his face, each one a story of battles fought in boardrooms and classrooms, of sacrifices made in quiet homes. The teachers who had whispered his name earlier now sat in reverent silence, their eyes wide with recognition. Parents, some who had nodded at Margaret's earlier barbs, now shifted uncomfortably, their gazes dropping to their laps. The students, Amara's students, stared at Dr. Brooks, sensing he was more than a figure in the shadows. He was the root of the strength they saw in their teacher. Amara's eyes met her father's across the distance, a fleeting connection that held the weight of a lifetime. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Her hands rested lightly on the podium, her silver clutch untouched, her posture a quiet testament to the lessons he had woven into her soul. The lilies along the stage's edge seemed to lean toward her, their fragrance mingling with the charged air. The boy who had spoken, now back in his seat, sat straighter, his eyes still shining with the courage he'd found in her. The girl with the notebook in the third row clutched it tightly, her pen stilled, as if the moment itself was too sacred to capture. Margaret Hensley's composure cracked. Her hands, trembling now, fumbled with the edge of her dress, her earlier confidence unraveling like thread pulled too tight. She didn't look at Dr. Brooks, didn't dare meet Amara's gaze. Her words, unique background, certain students, hung in the air like a stain exposed by the boy's testimony and now dwarfed by the silent presence of a father who needed no stage to command. A parent in the front row, who had chuckled at Margaret's remarks, leaned forward, her eyes glistening with something like shame. Another whispered to her neighbor, a soft apology barely audible, as if the room itself demanded accountability. Dr. Elijah Brooks nodded once, gesture so subtle it might have been missed, but it landed like a stone in still water. Then without a word he turned and walked toward the exit, his step steady, unhurried. The auditorium seemed to exhale, not in relief but in awe, as if the air had been holding its breath for him. He didn't pause, didn't glance back, but his departure was not an end. It was a spark igniting a shift that rippled through every heart. The camera followed him until the door closed softly behind him, the sound a quiet thunder in the silence. The host, adrift in the moment, cleared his throat, his voice thin and uncertain. "Well, that was something," he stammered, glancing at Amara for rescue, but she offered none, her gaze now sweeping the crowd, not in triumph but in quiet invitation, as if asking them to see what her father had always seen in her. The students sat forward, their faces alight with a loyalty that needed no words. The girl with the notebook began writing again, her hand trembling, as if trying to capture the weight of a moment that had changed her. The auditorium was no longer just a room. It was a crucible, forged by a boy's courage, Amara's resolve, and a father's silent pride. The lilies stood as witnesses, their petals trembling as if in reverence. Margaret sat frozen, her hands still, her face a portrait of realization too late. The parents who had whispered apologies now sat in silence, their earlier laughter a memory they wished to erase. The teachers, once murmuring Dr. Brooks' name, now nodded to each other, their respect a quiet vow. Amara stepped back from the podium, her white dress catching the light like a beacon. The crowd didn't applaud, not yet. They were too caught in the spell of what they'd witnessed, a moment that wasn't a speech or a spectacle but a transformation. The host, sensing the need to move on, fumbled for his notes, but his words would be forgotten. The real story was in the silence, in the man who had stood and left without speaking, in the daughter who carried his light. The auditorium, with its golden chandeliers and trembling lilies, was a space reborn, awakened not by words, but by the quiet power of presence. The auditorium of Edison High School was a changed place, its air still vibrating with the quiet power of Dr. Elijah Brooks' departure. The chandeliers hung heavy, their golden light now a soft witness to a moment that had reshaped the room's soul. Amara Brooks stood at the podium, her white dress glowing like a quiet flame, her silver clutch a steadfast companion on the stage's edge. The crowd, students, parents, faculty, sat in a hush, their faces a canvas of awe, shame, and something new, something stirred by a boy's raw testimony and a father's silent stand. Margaret Hensley, her navy dress a stark contrast. To her faltering composure stared at her hands, her earlier words now a weight she couldn't shed. The host, his script a forgotten relic, stammered through a transition, but his voice was a faint echo, drowned by the tide of what had just transpired. The moment Dr. Elijah Brooks walked out, the auditorium didn't erupt. It settled, as if the world had tilted just enough to let truth find its footing. Amara's eyes, which had followed her father's exit, now returned to the crowd, not with triumph but with a quiet invitation to see what he had always seen. A legacy built not on titles, but on presence. The lilies along the stage, their petals, trembling in the faint draft, seemed to bow to this truth. The students, especially those Amara had mentored, sat forward, their eyes shining with a loyalty that needed no words. The girl with the notebook in the third row clutched it tightly, her pen still, as if the moment was too vast to capture. The boy who had spoken, now back in his seat, stared at the stage, his hands no longer trembling but steady, as if Amara's strength had become his own. Then as the silence stretched, a new ripple began, not on the stage but beyond it. The next day a photograph surfaced, not on newsstands or viral feeds, but in the quiet corners of the community. It showed Amara and her father standing under an ancient oak in the school courtyard, their hands clasped, the late afternoon light casting a warm glow on Dr. Brooks's silver hair. There was no caption, no hashtag, no call for attention, just the image, raw and unadorned, like a memory shared in whispers. It was taken by a student, a quiet freshman with a camera, who had seen them in that unguarded moment and felt compelled to capture it. The photo spread, not with the frenzy of scandal, but with the slow, steady pulse of truth, passed from phone to phone, from teacher to parent, from student to friend. The story of that night didn't make headlines, but it took root in the hearts of those who were there. Teachers began sharing it in staff rooms, their voices low with reverence, not for Amara's award, but for the way she carried her father's light. Parents who had laughed at Margaret's barbs now spoke in hushed tones, some apologizing to each other in the school parking lot, their words clumsy but sincere. Students, especially those who had felt invisible, began to see Amara not just as a teacher, but as a beacon, someone who saw them when no one else did. The girl with the notebook wrote a poem about the night, her words scrawled in the margins. She stood, and he stood, and we all learned to stand. Dr. Elijah Brooks was no longer just the regional superintendent, the man who had turned down power to rebuild schools. He became something simpler, something greater, the father in the back row. The name spread, not as a title, but as a story whispered in classrooms, shared over coffee, written in the margins of meeting notes. It wasn't his position that defined him, but his silence, his choice to let his daughter shine without claiming the light for himself. The gold pin on his lapel, once a symbol of authority, was now a quiet emblem of a legacy that needed no name card. Margaret Hensley didn't speak again that night. She slipped out before the ceremony ended, her navy dress a shadow against the auditorium's glow. No one saw her apologize, but no one saw her defend her words either. She became a footnote, her barbed praise a cautionary tale that lingered in the community's memory. The host, his role diminished, closed the event with a voice that trembled, his usual polish lost to the weight of what he'd witnessed. The lilies still lining the stage stood as silent sentinels, their fragrance a reminder of a moment that had changed the room forever. The photograph of Amara and her father became a quiet talisman. A teacher pinned it to her bulletin board. No explanation needed. A parent shared it with her book club, her voice breaking as she described the night. A student, the boy who had spoken, taped it inside his locker, a reminder that he was worth something. The story spread, not through headlines but through people, those who had been there, those who had felt the shift, those who understood that legacy isn't built with words but with presence. Dr. Brooks didn't need to speak, didn't need to claim the stage. His daughter carried his light, and in her, he was seen. The auditorium, once a crucible of tension, became a sacred space in memory. The community didn't call Amara a hero or Dr. Brooks a legend. They called them what they were, a daughter who stood tall, a father who stood silent. The oak tree in the courtyard where the photograph was taken became a pilgrimage site of sorts, where students left notes and teachers paused to reflect. The legacy wasn't in the award Amara received, but in the truth she and her father embodied, a truth that didn't need applause, only witnesses. The story of that night lived on, not in fanfare, but in the quiet spaces, where those who had been there carried it forward, a legacy without a name card, etched in the hearts of a community forever changed. What did this story spark in you? Share your thoughts below. Where were you watching and what moments made you pause? Thank you for joining us on this journey of truth and quiet strength. Subscribe for our next story, and we'll be back soon, ready to explore more pivotal moments.